to the Global Justice Report, an online production of the Center for Global Justice. I'm Cliff Durand, your host for today's program. The Center for Global Justice, El Centro para la Justicia Global, is a multinational and bilingual research center in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. The center is devoted to research and learning for a better world and empowering a solidarity economy. Due to the pandemic, we have discontinued our in-person events and instituted these online webinars. Without our previous revenue-generating programs, we now depend on your donations to support these webinars and to be able to continue to pay our Mexican staff. You can donate at our website, www.globaljusticecenter.org. Today's webinar is number 50 in this series, which began last June 1, in fact. So we have a year's webinars now. Today is Memorial Day in the United States. We're told that this is a day to honor the sacrifice of those who defended democracy and freedom. But the reality was that most of our wars were started under false pretenses and were actually for resource theft, imperial hubris, and racial animus. We can honor the noble ideals soldiers carried with them into battle, but not the imperial purposes they were being used for. As U.S. Marine Corps General Smedley Butler famously said, "War is a racket." With the collapse of the Soviet Union 3 decades ago, the United States emerged as the world's sole superpower. There were many who argued that world order required that the U.S. maintain its hegemony and prevent the rise of any possible challenger in any region. U.S. foreign policy has long been guided by this effort to stabilize a unipolar world with the U.S. as top dog. Globalization brought economies in the South into global capitalism. The rise of independent nations of Latin America, Africa, and Asia have been a challenge to this dominance. Russia and China today aspire to a place in a multipolar world. This is something the Washington foreign policy establishment cannot abide. After 4 years of Donald Trump's erratic foreign policies, the Biden administration now seeks to return to a world order under U.S. leadership. It sees the rise of China and of Russia as a threat. As Secretary of State Antony Blinken complained to the Chinese foreign minister on his first meeting with them, China is a destabilizing force in East Asia. Destabilizing. Clearly, the U.S. is unwilling to accept a multipolar world. It aims for a world order that reflects, as the euphemism puts it, our values and interests. That is, the interests of corporate capitalism. Today, we're honored to have with us Vijay Prashad, Indian-born, a voice from the global South, who tells it like it is. Vijay is Executive Director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. He is author of The Darker Nations, A People's History of the Third World, and Washington Bullets, and nearly 30 other books. Prashad has taught at Trinity College in the US the American University in Beirut, and currently is a senior non-resident fellow at the Renmin University of China. He's chief editor of Leftward Books, correspondent for Global Trotter Media, and columnist for Frontline. Well, without any more from me, let me turn the floor over to Vijay and let you hold forth. Welcome.
Well, first, Cliff, thanks a lot for that. And it's a pleasure to be with the Center for Global Justice. I just wish I was in San Miguel with you instead of on Zoom. But this is a new generation. These are the Zoomers. And
Yes.
that's where we are. Hi, Liz. Nice to see you. I haven't seen Liz in a long time. That's great. Well, you asked me to talk a little bit about the Biden administration. And it's one of those perennial things in a country like the United States, where there are effectively two parties, and one party holds the flank of the more conservative section, whatever really that means. There's some complexity there, and the other party holds fast to some sort of liberal dispensation. And these parties generally go one to the other, back and forth, in some rotation. If you look at it from, say, 1900, they're pretty much almost even in terms of who's been at least holding executive office. Legislative office, it's also not that much of a hold by one or the other. And what happens is that as we well know, that people generally in the left liberal side of the spectrum begin to despair when the right is in power. So when there's Reagan in power, it's distressing. And then there's a hope that a liberal will come and salvage some humanity, some small measure of humanity. And then you get another nutcase, you get a George W. Bush, and then you hope that an Obama will come, salvage some humanity. Then you get another nutcase, Donald Trump, and then you feel Biden will show up and salvage some humanity. And there is this perennial, this cyclical kind of, a pattern of seeing, a kind of nutcase in power, and then there's some hope that somebody moderately decent will come. This, of course, is the great illusion of American power, this feeling that you're oscillating between nutcases and then reason. Well, in fact, that is perhaps true, at least in rhetorical terms, it's true. It is true that the Republicans generally are much more robust in their use of the flag and Christianity and the right of America to bomb anybody and so on. And that's true. Ronald Reagan spoke in a certain register which would be familiar to George W. Bush, which is terribly familiar to Donald Trump. Donald Trump is in a direct line backwards to George W. Bush, to Ronald Reagan. Not to entirely forget George H.W. Bush, but he's a marginal figure in this line. It's also true that in some way Democrats position themselves as more reasonable people, so-called more multilateral, less America first. So Biden goes back, yes, down a long train, maybe as far back as Jimmy Carter. And herein lies the rub of it, because you see, Carter is an interesting figure. Carter now is defined in people's mind as a progressive, even. Certainly, it's true that in recent years, Jimmy Carter has been building houses and he's been making awfully decent statements about world events, and he himself, I think, has positioned himself as something of a progressive. But if you remember the Carter record in the White House, I mean, just take the case of Nicaragua. The mining of the harbor in Managua, and so on. I mean, Carter's role in Afghanistan, it's disgraceful. It's difficult to actually see the lack of continuity between Carter and Reagan in terms of foreign policy in Latin America and in Afghanistan, if we just take the two of them. It's also worthwhile to remember that Carter's people in Iran were completely behind the Shah of Iran. Right till the last minute when the Shah was forced to abdicate rule, there was no human rights bogus from Jimmy Carter at that time. Human rights imperialism hadn't really come into focus, into sharp focus, as it would, after the Soviet Union had collapsed. So you didn't hear much. So if we're clear that, the Democrats certainly have this delightful way of positioning themselves as multilateralists or as reasonable in a sense, and the Republicans just don't care. They just come out and say it's flag, it's country, it's Christianity, it's whatever. There is a certain cultural gap between the two political forces, but they are united by a commitment to American power exercised in the world without any challenge. There is no difference in the two parties on this. There is none. That's because of several reasons, and I'll go into some of them in a minute. But I just wanted to put this out there so that we're not, not confused at all. And I don't think any of us are confused. But I just want to clarify that these are two cultural forms of U.S. primacy. There are two cultural forms of primacy. The distinction between Republicans and Democrats comes from what cultural motifs they draw on from American history to, in a sense, articulate the argument for primacy. They both articulate the argument for primacy. One does it in a much more kind of brusque, frontiersman type of language. Just go out there and just kill people because we have the right to. And the other tries to camouflage it in, manifest destiny kind of language. Both of them similar but different cultural resonance. Now, I have been always interested, at least in the post World War II era, have been always interested in the way the United States government formulates its own idea of itself. There's no need to read into US policy necessarily if they are telling you themselves what they believe. I'm going to come back to Biden's interim national security strategic guidance, which was released on the 3rd of March 2021. Spent a lot of time reading it. I find it very interesting. So I'm going to come back to Biden's interim national security guidance. I think it's important to look at what the Biden administration is saying itself. Again, we don't have to impose a theory on them. We don't have to excessively interpret their actions alone, although you must do that. There is a protocol in that. But we also have to see what are they saying. What they're saying and then what they're doing, those are valuable pieces of evidence to judge the nature of the Biden administration. But the first thing, what they say, in the post-World War II era, the US State Department released a number of documents, some secret, which we've read later, and some at the time. Each of these documents quite clearly puts out the US government's understanding of itself. And the document I hold very close to my assessment is the document where the US government has a particular line that I use in my book, Washington Bullets. It's a cornerstone of the argument in that book. The US government says that the purpose or the goal of US power is preponderance. They use the word preponderance. It's a very tough word, preponderance. A lesser word is primacy. That's what the US government seeks. It seeks primacy. It doesn't seek to be one among, now 193 countries in the United Nations, member states of the. No, it seeks primacy. It seeks preponderance. It seeks to be number one. This is a directly articulated strategy. You got to start from this. This is why, for instance, Chinese foreign ministry documents in the last 20 years have been saying, look, we seek multipolarity. We don't want this age of one country being primus inter pares, so-called primus inter pares, first among equals. Actually not. Actually, preponderance is not exactly primus inter pares. Primus inter pares acknowledges that other countries are equal. The United States actually doesn't acknowledge other countries are equal. Even Obama, the great liberal standard, so-called liberal standard, his most recent autobiography is called The Promised Land. The promised land. I mean, there's something special about this country. It's a city on the hill, it's the promised land, and so on and so forth. It's not actually first among equals. It's important to recognize that. It's in fact different from everybody else. It's blessed. It's a city on the hill. It's superior to everybody else. And that's what preponderance refers to. It's a religious concept. It's not just primacy. As I said, primacy is a lesser idea. Primacy merely means we want to be, in the dominant position, hegemonic position vis-a-vis others. Preponderance suggests manifest destiny. All of these catchwords of US power have a religious significance to them, a significance of cultural superiority. That's very important. These are not just terms of geopolitics and things like that. There is that sense, we are the promised people somehow. It's important to register that. Anyway, this idea that the United States must be the dominant power in the world is justified in all kinds of convoluted ways. One of the ways is that the US government is the most superior government in terms of its commitment to values. Its commitment to values. This is reiterated once again in the current Biden's interim statement. They say directly that it's the United States, which must confront the authoritarian states of China, Russia, and so on. It's the US that will preserve freedom, and everybody else is trying to create authoritarianism. It's a very curious thing. We'll come back to that in a minute. But it harkens back again to the high Cold War era, where the propagandists of the US State Department coined the phrase free world. The free world was the world of Europe and the United States. Everything else was unfree, the free world. So you then had radio free Europe, radio free America, the free this, free that, the what is it called, the something for cultural freedom. Everything was about freedom. Then Reagan would take freedom and make it, in a sense, his talisman. Every speech Reagan gave, he talked about freedom, the freedom of people in the United States, the freedom that they will not necessarily bring to the world, but the freedom that the United States will protect and preserve. I just want to read from the interim guidance to clarify this. You see, Biden and his team write that the United States has to intervene in the world, not to make freedom in the world, but to keep freedom for the United States. Let me just read the sentence for you. This moment, the current moment, this was published March 2021. This moment calls upon us. By us, he means the United States, not the world community. Again, important to recognize. This moment calls upon us to lean forward, not shrink back, to boldly engage the world to keep Americans safe, prosperous, and free. You see, it's not universal values or universal outcomes. The United States has to intervene in the world to keep US nationals safe, prosperous, and free. The freedom of the free world was not necessarily for others. It was always to keep the United States free. So in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, it was acceptable to support dictators all over the world. It was acceptable to make coup d'etats against democratic regimes, because the point was not to create freedom there, but for the United States to enjoy a certain freedom. We'll come back to what is this definition of freedom. What does freedom mean? I'm going to come back to that. You see, I hope you get the point of these texts. They don't say, there's a free world, and the point is to then make freedom leak into the whole world and make the whole world free. There's no understanding of that. The United States seeks preponderance. Preponderant power is actually the phrase. The United States seeks preponderant power to maintain freedom for the free world. And authoritarianism is acceptable for the rest of the world as long as it doesn't interrupt the freedom of the free world. And that's a very interesting way to articulate this issue. So Biden in 2021, there's no gap really from the 1945 view of the world. The United States must engage in the world, as if Trump was not engaging in the world. You see, this is the game they play. Trump was withdrawing, America first. No, Trump was saying exactly the same thing. He was saying we should put US interests first when we intervene in the world. We're going to have a trade war with China in order to put US interests first. There was actually no difference between Obama, Trump, and Biden in this. Difference may have been that Trump was more aggressive in his rhetoric and so on, but I don't see the actual difference of policy. Um, Obama was also pivoting to Asia. We come to that again. Obama was pivoting towards Asia to also put US interests first. He was also, in that sense, America first. This is not the John Birch Society kind of, people come back, no foreign policy, no intervening abroad. There's none of that in Trump, and none of that in Biden, none of that in Obama. Intervene in the world for the United States to maintain its preponderant power, intervene in the world so that US citizens can be safe, prosperous, and free. Full stop. That's the actual goal of US power. That's the goal of US power. Look, let's face it. When Samuel Huntington wrote his terrific book in the 1960s called Changing, no, something Power in a Changing World. Sorry, I should remember the name of it. It's a terrific book. What Huntington, it's terrific because it's clear as daylight what he's arguing and what the State Department absorbs from that book. What Huntington argued was a thesis called military modernization. He said in most of the formerly colonial world, the colonizers didn't build any democratic institutions that could become democratic. So like in a country like, say, Bolivia or wherever, he said, and he used several of these examples. He said, look, in let's say in the Central African Republic, there are no institutions. The French in Mali didn't build institutions that would enable Mali to have an easy move to democracy, and they also neglected to create a culture of democracy. They didn't neglect, by the way, they forcibly didn't create a culture of democracy. That's the nature of colonialism. So that after independence in these countries, Huntington argued, the only institution capable of modernizing the country is the military. Therefore, the United States government should back military dictatorships all over the third world. That was his clear as daylight superb book, because Huntington didn't hold back any punches. He basically gave this political science justification, scientific justification for the coup d'etat against Arbenz in 1953 in Guatemala, all the way out to the coup d'etat against Salvador Allende in Chile in 1973, and then against Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso in 1987. This was a perfect description. They don't need to be free. They need to just be held in some sort of, long-term concentration camp type of agenda where they might move to modernization, but they're being held in that condition under the overall supervision of US primacy or preponderance, allows people in the United States to be safe, prosperous, and free. You see, so there is no question of freedom for the rest of the world. I'm saying all this. I know the brief is, what about Biden? But I'm saying all this because we need to understand the philosophy. We need to understand the philosophy of US imperialism before we get to the particulars. And that's why I've taken this time, these, I don't know, Cliff, 20 minutes or so to just lay out what's underneath, the new Cold War against China, which is what I'll spend a few minutes on, and then the sanctions regime against, 24 odd countries, 30 some countries around the world. Okay, so that was the first part. That was the sort of philosophical underpinnings of US imperialism. Now, we know that the United States, developed global institutional structure to maintain this preponderance. And that institutional structure had three different aspects. The first was it relied upon itself. So it's now well known, Nick Turse gives the number of 800 US military bases around the world. In fact, last year, the Department of Defense released a document, page 2 of which it said it has 4,800 properties around the world. 4,800 discrete properties around the world. That's a lot of properties held by the US military. Also, interesting study from Brown University said that the US military is the largest institutional polluter of greenhouse gases in the world. Well, because it has such an enormous footprint, no other multinational corporation is the size of the US military, which is why the US military is the largest institutional polluter of at least greenhouse gases around the world. So, the first aspect of exercising preponderance is the United States having its own military. As you know, it has the highest military expenditure of any country. If you add up the next 10 countries, it's just about where the US is, and so on. This is relatively well known. Also, the United States, with a robust domestic military production, is the one of the biggest, in fact, in recent years, the biggest exporter of arms. And this brings us to the second point: exporter of arms mainly to its allies. And that's the second point. United States creates an incredibly dense alliance system around the world, and the alliance system is cleverly crafted. Again, if you read US strategic documents, you get a sense of this. So that in South America, for instance, the key country currently is Colombia. Colombia is like the anchor of US power in South America. But in an earlier period, if you just look at it, the two most important, most significant coups the US government did were essentially to formulate, to get an ally in order to dominate a region. And the two most important coups were the 1964 coup against Brazil, that coup that lasted, I don't know, 21 years or something. The moment Brazil comes into the column of the United States, it dominates Latin America. Because remember, it's out of Brazil that Operation Condor is actually run. All the subsequent dictatorships in the southern cone, in Uruguay, Chile, Argentina, and Bolivia, they're basically run out of the Brazil office, where Ambassador Gordon, ran the show for the United States. So the Brazil coup of 64, very important. And then you go to Asia, where the 65 coup against the government of Sukarno, and bringing in General Suharto to power, massacring 1 million communists, that played an enormous role because it anchored US power in not only in Southeast Asia, but crucially over the Straits of Malacca. Right till the present, the Chinese, for instance, talk about the Malacca dilemma, because it's through the Straits of Malacca that oil goes to Japan, to China, and so on. The US, by controlling Indonesia, United States with its partner Australia, by controlling Indonesia, was able to have a partial lock on the Straits of Malacca. They could militarize the Indian Ocean. This was beneficial, these two coups. So an alliance system had to be created. In Washington Bullets, I go over how the alliance system was created in Europe. In other words, the stolen elections in Italy, in Greece, and in France right after the war was essential to eject the communists from the possibility of power. The return of the Nazis to the Federal Republic of Germany, the Bundesrepublic, where Nazis were allowed to enter into the judiciary, enter into government. In fact, the new secret service created in West Germany was headed by a Nazi who brought his entire network into the secret service. This stuff is in the public record. I merely assemble it in Washington Bullets. The alliance system had to be created. Governments had to be overthrown. The left had to be marginalized. You got South Korea, where a dictatorship was allowed to rule. You have Japan, where Japan was under occupation. And again, Japanese war criminals were brought back to become prime ministers of Japan in the 1950s. They created an alliance system and set aside the demands of the people. So remember, I said an institutional framework was created. First was the United States exercised power through military bases, its military expansion, and so on, enormous expansion. Still remaining today. And the US Department of Defense now says 4,800 properties. At Tricontinental in July, we'll release a document about US militarization of Africa. It's chilling to read their own statements about what they're up to. So that's the first element. Second is building the alliance system, built with great force and violence, really, with coup d'etats, with muscling governments, with murder of the left. And as you well know, the way in which private US capital funded the Christian Democrats in Italy and in Germany to ensure that the left was marginalized. The stealing of the elections in Italy are actually quite emblematic of how this alliance system was built. It wasn't just built because Italians were somehow close to the United States. You just remember that during the fight against Mussolini, it was the Communist Party in Italy that had the love and admiration of the people. And Italy could very well have gone in the direction of Yugoslavia, where the partisans were the only ones who had the love and respect of the people. Greece would have gone in the direction of Yugoslavia. Again, the partisans, the ones who had the love and affection of the people. But you see, look what they did in Greece. They allow the right, the fascistic right wing to come to power, and then one after the other on a punctual basis, military coups in Greece. Now it is all forgotten. People forget that they shaped Greek political life, culture, by allowing the fascists to come back and by military coup decimating the left in Greece. In Greece, Greek political culture was manufactured through force. This is what I'm trying to say, is that we forget this now. You look at Greece and you think, oh, it's a normal European country. Wait a minute. They actually created this kind of environment where the left was totally marginalized, sent into exile, massacred, and so on. The same in Turkey. The same in Turkey. A long military coup period, backed again by the United States, the drawing in of Turkey into NATO, marginalizing and killing off the left, allowing the worst elements of the Turkish military to go after the Kurds and so on. This was a practice. This was a process. This didn't just happen by nature or by evolution. It's the intervention of US power that shapes the world so that its alliance system can be robust. But there was a third point, which is how, particularly from the 1980s, after the third world debt crisis had decimated the power, political power, independent political power of the non-aligned movement, you see the United States making a push to dominate international institutions. It is during this period that the IMF, the World Bank, and so on get totally taken over by the US. It's also in this period that the United Nations General Assembly is slowly marginalized. United States used the vote on Zionism is racism to delegitimize the UN General Assembly. By the way, if you're interested in this material, it's all very well assembled by Daniel Patrick Moynihan in his memoir of being the US ambassador to the UN. Moynihan was not sent there by a liberal president, unless you consider Richard Nixon a liberal in today's terms. He was sent there by Nixon and Kissinger, and his memoir is called A Dangerous Place. Now, the thing is that Moynihan, by a dangerous place, is not referring to the world. He's talking about the UN General Assembly. And he goes in there to basically set aside the General Assembly and make the Security Council the only game in town. So the third aspect of US preponderance, what it drives an agenda through, is to delegitimize multilateralism, to take over these institutions, or to basically make them not any longer be as robust as they could have been. No illusions. The UN wasn't some idyllic body where it is rife with contradictions, but they wanted to delegitimize it so that they could exercise power independently. So that's the second part of what I wanted to suggest. First, the kind of underlying philosophy of imperialism. Secondly, what were the institutional structures created? And now, in Cliff, the remaining 10, 12 minutes, I want to give two examples. The new Cold War on China, and then the sanctions policy. So I hope that's clear. Now, I should say I haven't talked about the economics of all this, and I'm happy to talk about that later. But I didn't want to detain us because that was not entirely the brief of it, although it will come up when I talk about China. Okay. Why is the US so bothered by China? And let me read for you from this great Biden's interim guidance. Now, he says, we must contend with the reality that the distribution of power across the world is changing, creating new threats. Okay, pause. The distribution of power. What distribution of power? What are you talking about? What you mean is you cannot countenance any challenge to US preponderance. Okay, and just the challenge to US preponderance creates new threats. Very next sentence. China, in particular, has rapidly become more assertive. Interesting language. You see, It's one thing to have your laborer be servile. When your laborer comes to work and just does their job and goes home, you're quite happy with the laborer. You don't mind the laborer there. When the laborer comes to you and says, listen, can I get a raise? Or the laborer says to you, can you improve the conditions of life? Or the laborer, worse, the laborer says to you, can I become part of the decision making process? Then you say, go stay in your place. How dare you be assertive? You're violating and creating new threats. You see, what has China done? Has China threatened the United States in any way? Because they say that China has become more assertive. Has China threatened the United States? Okay, that's a good proposition. In foreign policy documents from China, there is no threat to the United States. I have read, hundreds of hours of transcripts of Chinese Ministry of External Affairs spokespersons. No threats. I've read about 10 or 12 accounts by leading Chinese intellectuals, intellectuals of foreign policy. None of them talk about China as the necessary next preponderant power. They all talk about multipolarity. So, what do we mean by China is becoming assertive? I mean, what does that mean? Secondly, has China built a military force capable of challenging the United States? Nowhere near. What China has done is it's able to defend its borders, but it can't challenge the United States. You've got 20 U.S. bases in Africa. Inside Africa, in Agadez, you will see the world's largest drone base. The Chinese have two bases in Africa and they are built up. They say China is in Africa. What are the two bases? I don't know if any of you know where the bases are. They are not in Mali, they are not in the Sahel, they are not in West Africa. The two bases are in the Horn of Africa. One is in Djibouti, the other is in Somalia. They were both set up to assist China's participation in a UN resolution guided project against piracy off the coast of Somalia. That is what the Chinese are doing there. It's a naval base and it supports the UN mission to monitor the sea lanes to prevent piracy. Now, I have mixed feelings about the piracy issue. I'm happy to talk about that, but that's not the point. The point is, China has not got bases there to contest the United States. Nobody can contest the footprint of US power at all. Neither the Russians nor the Chinese. They are both defending their borders. If you look at Russian power projection, it is all about defending its borders. The front line of Ukraine and the front line in Syria. Obviously, Syria is not in China's borders, but in fact, it is, because both Ukraine and Syria have the two only remaining warm water ports that Russia has in Sebastopol and Tartus. You may remember in the 1950s when Mao goes, I think maybe right in 1950, Mao goes to meet Stalin in Moscow to discuss the Sino-Soviet treaty, the new treaty that they were going to make. And the sticking point was Port Arthur, because the Soviets at the time told the Chinese, look, we can't afford to give up Port Arthur. Port Arthur is our only warm water port in the Pacific. We can't afford that. Dalian, for the town of Dalian. And eventually that becomes a major part of the Sino-Soviet dispute, because Mao says, no, you have to give Dalian back to us. And all the ports in the Pacific, they are Chinese, and you can't even put your ships there. It's a big battle between the two. The Russians have been extremely worried about this lack of a warm water port that goes back to Port Arthur a long time ago. By the way, Port Arthur was the core of the battle between Japan and Russia in 1904, in that war. They fought over Port Arthur. So neither the Russians nor the Chinese are actually, threatening US power, not even threatening US base structures, let alone threatening the US mainland. I mean, I have yet to see a story about a Chinese ship coming near the US, Chinese warship. Lots of Chinese ships enter the ports, but no Chinese warship has come into US waters. Whereas the United States is consistently plying these freedom of navigation flotillas right into Chinese waters to provoke the Chinese. So When Biden's team says that China has rapidly become more assertive, what do they mean by that? You see, this whole new Cold War is premised on this. And here's what they mean. They say China is the only competitor potentially capable of combining its economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to mount a sustained challenge. Aha! Here's the real thing. China is the only competitor potentially capable mounting a sustained challenge to what? To what? Not to the United States government. Because Biden and so on are quite reasonable. They understand China actually cannot threaten the US government or US power itself. But they say it's the only one that can mount a sustained challenge to a stable and open international system. Now, what do they mean by stable and open international system? They mean the free world. What do they mean by the free world? They mean US interests. They mean that China is the only country that can interfere with US interests. And I want to spend a few minutes on that. What does that mean? Is it clear so far? Is it okay? Yeah. Okay. So, what do they mean by that? Well, um, you see, the Chinese had been quite clever after 1978, the reform of 78. Quite clever. Unlike other countries in the third world, and face it, China is a third world country, or at least has been until recently. Until then, from 1978 onwards, China had played a very smart game. China understood full well that the Kosygin reforms that had been attempted in Russia, both in 1965 and, if I'm not wrong, in 73 or maybe 79, there were Alexei Kosygin ran two reform eras. One was in the mid 60s, 65, and the second was either 73 or 76, somewhere around there. At any rate, the Chinese were quite clear that they needed to have inputs of technology and science, that they needed to up the productive forces in China. They were quite clear about this. So, to do that, you needed investment of a high kind, certainly, and you also needed some science and tech inputs. And they saw that both Russia, the Soviet Union, and the West were advanced in tech. No doubt that the West had made some significant leaps in various technologies. So what the Chinese did intelligently, and when you compare China with India, you see how India faltered, whereas China was very clever. What the Chinese did was they said, you can come in, here's a free trade zone, our workers are better fed, they are better educated, they have more stamina, they get sick less than workers in any other part of the third world because of the Mao era reforms. Because the Mao era reforms have produced a very good workforce. You can come in and build your factories. That's acceptable. You will, of course, it's capitalism. You'll exploit our labor. That's why I never understand when lefties get so bent out of shape saying, oh my God, they opened it to capitalism. Well, what do you expect? I mean, how else are you going to run these things in this way? But then they said something intelligent, and this is what lefties don't pick up on. They said, okay, you can do this. That's fine. But here's what's written in the agreement. You have to tell us what the science is behind your factory, and you have to tell us what the tech is. And this is important, why they had science. You see, technology is yesterday's science, but science is tomorrow's technology. So it was very important for them to ask for science transfer as much as tech transfer. And that's what the Chinese did. So that by the time of the 1990s and certainly into the 2000s, in several areas, China started to make its own scientific and technological breakthroughs. So that by the time Obama comes along, it becomes clear to US tech companies that China is far ahead in robotics, in so-called green technology, and eventually in telecommunications, in 5G and so on. China is way ahead. This is what they mean when they say that it's capable of combining its economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to mount a sustained challenge. Let's leave out their own sentence and add in to the United States and to Silicon Valley. Evidence for this. During Trump's entire trade war, not one Silicon Valley executive came out and said we oppose the trade war. In fact, Tim Cook, head of Apple, went to meet Trump And all he said to Trump was that the trade war unfairly advantages Samsung because the South Koreans can take advantage. You see, Silicon Valley was willing to take a short term hit if they had a long term victory. They want to see Chinese tech developments broken. See, that's what this trade war was about. It's to get China to surrender its advances, technological advances, some 1 or 2 generations ahead of the United States. And here comes imperialism, because the United States recognizes it actually cannot compete with China in tech. It cannot compete with China robotics, high speed rail, none of these things. It also cannot compete with China when it comes to loan making in the rest of the world, because Chinese loans in Africa, Asia, Latin America are not like structural adjustment credits that come from the IMF or from the Paris and London group. They are patient capital. We've seen that in many countries in Latin America, where the Chinese invest and then they just let it go. They wait. They take a long time. They have a patient strategy. It's called the strategy of patient capital. Inexcusable. United States would prefer to almost go to war against China than come to terms with the fact that the Chinese have made technological and scientific advances, and that their firms are in effect outflanking Silicon Valley, which is a major driver of the US economy. That's at the heart of that conflict. And you use extra economic power to try to constrain them. That basically is the definition of imperialism. So, what's that extra economic power? It is the massive buildup of the Indo-Pacific force, now with hypersonic cruise missiles getting ready to be deployed, which can land in Beijing in 15 minutes from launch, and so on. Very dangerous. It's the creation of new alliance systems like the Quad, that is Japan, Australia, India, and the United States. No surprise that the first multilateral meeting that Biden held, it wasn't with NATO countries, wasn't with the G7, it was with the Quad. The first time he met world leaders was the Quad summit, where he had Narendra Modi, Scott Morrison, and the current prime minister after Shinzo Abe. What's his name? Forgotten it. Just slipped my mind. The four of them met. That was the first meeting by Biden. So the issue of basically encircling and kneecapping China in good mafia style is central to the Biden plan. Look at the way Antony Blinken talked to the Chinese, in particularly Mr. Wang, one of the most senior Chinese leaders. Normally in these diplomatic meetings, when they meet, they're very polite to each other. They say, "Welcome to Alaska. It's a gateway to Asia. It's a great place. If you look on a clear day, you can see Moscow." That's how they talk to each other. They don't say, "We're going to teach you a lesson how to live in a stable and open international system." Stable and open. That's the statement in the interim guidance. Stable and open. They don't actually mean stable and open. You'd have to be foolish. They mean the free world, which means the world according to US interests. So that's on the one side. That's my understanding of the new Cold War. Total continuity from Obama through Trump into Biden. No difference at all, not even of emphasis. Anybody who tells me Biden is polite imperialism, just go and read the transcript of Blinken's way he talked to Foreign Counselor Wang. Just go read the transcript or watch the tape. It's really difficult to watch. I don't see any difference between Blinken and Pompeo. None whatsoever. Okay, Blinken is fluent in French, and that's that little thing that the Democrats have over the Republicans. They have this fluent in French thing, and they probably knows how to select the best wines. These are, elitist imperialists in a sense. And sometimes the Republicans put up people who have less cultivated instincts, perhaps, but they're all the same, at least in this case. Second, the use of illegal power, such as the sanctions regime, which is illegal. For instance, the US attempt to overthrow the government of Venezuela is an illegal act. There is no legality to this. It's a violation of the UN Charter by any reading. The creating of the Lima Group, led by Canada, actually, not by Peru. It's a misnamed group by Canada and Colombia, by the governments of Justin Trudeau and Ivan Duque, couldn't be more different in temperament and attitude and even political traditions, but they are totally united. 60% of the world's mining companies are domiciled in Canada. which is actually what drives Canadian foreign policy, not the good looks of Justin Trudeau. So, I mean, when you put these things together, you see that the United States runs this sort of illegal policy against weaker countries. It's easy, it's difficult to do a full on sanctions against China. China is a country 1.4 billion, it has a continental scale territory. You might try to mess things up by creating, some problems in Xinjiang or in Hong Kong or whatever, but the Chinese government is much more clever, and we can discuss that if you'd like. They have their own way of managing things. They are not going to be so quickly broken by the this kind of sanctions policy, the bullying that the US government uses, illegal bullying against Iran, against Lebanon, against Zimbabwe, against Venezuela, and so on and so forth. These are illegal policies. The US blockade on Cuba is an illegal policy. There's no legality to it, especially the so-called third party sanctions. In Europe there was just a judgment by the courts that said that, look, a German company doesn't have to abide by third party sanctions by the US government. There's no basis in international law to have this third party sanction business. It's what makes shipping companies unwilling to carry cargo in and out of Venezuela. It's extraordinary policy, and it's basically illegal. It goes against at least the UN Charter. So there is this bullying that takes place, and I think let's put that on the table. This is not going to work in China, and nor is the, in a sense, Gorbachev strategy. The United States has hoped for a Gorbachev to appear in the Politburo of the Chinese Communist Party, and just as Gorbachev did, sort of surrender the whole system to the US. I mean, Gorbachev is a disgrace, because it's not like it was even necessary. The direction that the USSR took, it was in great crisis, but there was no need to just totally surrender the whole thing, which is what he did. I mean, more adequate leadership, you would have had a different outcome. I don't think it's inevitable that the USSR had to collapse. All kinds of other countries plod along, they don't collapse so easily. It didn't collapse, it was actually dismantled. And Gorbachev plays a criminal role in dismantling the USSR, including his lieutenant Boris Yeltsin and so on. And the unimaginative so-called hardliners who decided to take the tank and try to... I mean, there were other ways to do these things, perhaps. But okay, maybe it's hindsight. But still, they're not going to find a Gorbachev in the Communist Party. And I'll tell you why not. Because Harvard University did a study recently that found that some 90% of the Chinese population holds the Communist Party in high regard. Some 90%. This is Harvard University. Now you can say, well, there's an error rate or whatever. Let's say the error rate is 50%. Okay. Let's say it's 50%. Let's say 45 to 50% of the population holds the CPC in high regard. Let's say half the population. That's a lot higher than the approval rating of a US president. A lot higher by miles. So it's not going to be easy to just say we'll find a Gorbachev and the Gorbachev will do our job. That Chinese government is very, very effectively managed. It's a very complicated structure. There are many standing committees. It's also not true that, say, Xi Jinping is like the singular guy. He is accountable to a lot of different committees. Now, it's interesting. People have found it worthwhile to give him latitude, and he's driving a kind of left agenda inside China. That's all true. There's no way that, let's say, after President Xi leaves, that somebody else is going to show up who's going to just dismantle the system. It's not that easy to do in China today. The Communist Party is quite integrated into society. We saw evidence of that during the fight against COVID-19, where the Communist Party played a major role, including doctors going in the thousands to Wuhan to volunteer and to actually switch out with non-Communist Party doctors. By doing things like that in public, talking about it in public, the stature of the Communist Party rises. That I, as a Communist Party doctor, fly into Hubei province and tell a non-Communist Party doctor, you can leave if you're scared of fighting the virus, I will do it in your place. That sends a message to society. It's quite a considerable achievement for the Communist Party at that period. They managed this very effectively. And the party put out a statement saying the reason you need to do it is because we joined the party to serve the people. That's interesting. I mean, we don't hear that during the whole pandemic in the United States. We didn't hear Democratic Party doctors say that we joined the who joins the Democratic Party? Nobody joined the Democratic Party in order to serve the people, and therefore in a hotspot Democratic Party doctors are going to go substitute from with apolitical doctors. You don't get any of that kind of thing. I think the people don't even know what it means to join a party. There are millions of members of the Communist Party in China, and they're not all opportunists. I can tell you that much. So, winding up, what is the core theme? The core theme is there are major continuities since at least the 1940s in US foreign policy. These are grounded around the term, or at least one term, like preponderance. I think it plays a role, helps us understand what's going on. There are institutional bases for this preponderance. There is, of course, the huge military apparatus, enormous military apparatus. There is this alliance system that's quite robust. For whatever reason, in different countries, it has different registers of why the alliance system endures. And then finally, the international system has been, in a sense, delegitimized. It doesn't have a way to advance its goals. There is the appearance of countries that would challenge US preponderance, no doubt about it. China is challenging US preponderance. Around the time China appeared as a challenge to US preponderance, from State Department linked intellectuals, we started to get terms like the Thucydides trap, which refers to the Athens and Sparta clash, saying that when a power is rising, it's inevitable that it will be a war. The Chinese don't want a Thucydides trap. They don't want to seek preponderance. They seek multipolarity. Evidence for that came in their attempt in the BRICS, now in the very defensive posture with Russia, and so on. I've engaged with Chinese bureaucrats for years, and I find a real shift in emphasis. The much more emphasis now on multipolarity. Previously, they used to talk about every country should do what it wants. We don't interfere in the foreign policy of other countries. For years, that was the annoying refrain from Chinese bureaucrats. Now they say quite clearly, we are for a multipolar world. China must have a seat at the table. It's a very interesting time. China is not going to surrender to the United States. There's going to be no Gorbachev, in Chinese with Chinese characteristics. It's just not going to happen. We're going to see this clash, this imposed war prosecuted by the United States intensify. The HMS Queen Elizabeth has sailed into the South China Sea. There are German warships in the South China Sea. There are French warships in the South China Sea. Very, very chilling developments. I think crucial to the fate of humanity is to fight against the advancement of this Cold War. Thanks a lot.
All right. Well, there's a lot to chew on there. Thank you for a very stimulating presentation. And now we come to question and answer, an opportunity for you to present your questions and comments. For those who are watching this on YouTube, you will have to send your questions to this email address, global.justice.cliff@gmail.com. I will monitor that and pass your questions on to our speaker. For those who are in the Zoom room with Vijay, you can present your questions and comments more directly. You just need to wave your hand so I can see you. I will put this on gallery view so I can see those who are in the Zoom room. And if you have a question or comment, just wave at me and I'll call. I see the first wave coming from Bob Stone. Go ahead, Bob.
Vijay, what a wonderful talk. Thank you so much. We are energized and informed and united by your analysis. Thank you. I want to ask a fairly straightforward question that's right under the surface of your talk. What is the benefit to capitalism of US imperialism? It seems to me that it's indisputable that if there hadn't been a China to otherate, alienate, make into an enemy, it would have to be invented. And it was. China has done nothing to provoke this kind of response. What is the gain, though? What are the forces? And I guess I'm asking a question about the military-industrial complex. How is it? What are the payoffs for global capitalism of the U.S. as policeman in chief of the world?
Cliff, how do we do this? Should we take one question, one answer, that kind of thing?
Well, I think so. Yeah, let's
Okay.
do it that way.
It's a great question, but also the answer needs to not be one homogeneous answer, because US capital is not a homogeneity. There are different fractions of US capital. There's industrial sections, even they have contradictions within them. There is a section of agribusiness, it has its own interests. A mining capital has its own interests, finance capital has its own interests, and let's, for want of better word, tech capital has its own interests. I think that each of these interests will be satisfied by different feints by the military industrial complex. So for instance, we know the coup against Arbenz was on behalf of United Fruit Company. That's on the table. In other words, that's orchard capitalism, let's say. Fruit capitalism had to be defended. They owned all that land. Arbenz was going to conduct land reform, modest land reform, and he had to be overthrown. We know that the coup against Iran was because of oil and oil prices. That was clear. That's there in the CIA documents. It's there from the government and so on. But it wasn't just that. Sometimes these coups are also in order to maintain an alliance system, because long-term political stability is more important than short-term economic gain. That's something Marxists forget. We should learn some lessons from the kind of left liberal commentators who focus entirely on political stability. But there's something to be gained from that, because you might overthrow a government where you don't have any economic problems immediately, but you have long-term stability issues. The government might say you can still continue to do business with us as usual, but you might feel there's some long-term issue. But at any rate, we know that oil companies, big, plantation kind of capitalism, that is to say, United Fruit and so on, they have their own reasons. We know that in Chile in 73, it was the copper companies, the mining companies, Anaconda and so on. They played a big role in pressuring Nixon. So different fractions of capital have a different use for the military industrial complex at different moments. We know, for instance, finance capital found it very valuable when the US government twice pressured the Japanese government to revise the yen. You will remember the Plaza Accord in 85, I believe, and the Reverse Plaza in 95. This was immense government pressure on Japan. In fact, look at how the administration of Obama did a coup, a parliamentary coup against the government of Hatoyama in 2009 in Japan, because Hatoyama threatened Okinawa base of the United States government. This went by without comment in the liberal commentariat in the United States. It was effectively a coup. Hatoyama wins an election on the basis of getting the US base off Okinawa, and when he comes to power, the US, Obama doesn't meet him in Tokyo. I mean, he embarrasses him, and in the Diet, then there's a vote, and he loses the vote. I mean, Hillary Clinton was there pressuring people and so on. That's a coup d'etat. It's what was done to Dilma Rousseff in Brazil. She faced, in a sense, a legislative coup d'etat, and so did Lago in Paraguay, faced a legislative coup d'etat. So I'm just putting this on the table because I want us to see that there are different fractions of capital which have different, opportunities and so on in different places. With China, the leading force of this is the tech companies, because China actually is threatening the tech companies. Because the way tech works is that they are rent collectors. They collect rent on their intellectual property. Apple doesn't make phones. It's Foxconn that makes phones. Apple collects rent. It's a rent-seeking firm. It collects rent on its intellectual property, which is why the United States protects intellectual property with the barrel of a gun. That's on behalf of tech companies, pharmaceutical companies. The waiver on of the COVID-19 vaccine is very much in line with this particular issue. These rent-seeking intellectual property firms, whether pharmaceuticals or high tech or so on, they are greatly challenged by China because China's scientific and tech accomplishments are going at least threatening to sideline the dominance of US based and European based firms. So they are actually fighting an existential battle. China already is the leading producer of so called green technology, batteries, photovoltaic cells, and so on. And which is why German photovoltaic producers have taken the Chinese to the WTO, and they can't keep losing the cases because the WTO says, look, you signed a piece of paper that said you can have a look at our schematics. So how have they done industrial espionage? There's no industrial espionage if you agree to hand over your schematics. It's not industrial espionage. So they are trying a political game against China, saying that they are industrial espionage or that their high-tech equipment will violate your privacy. So in that sense, China is actually threatening these firms, is threatening this section of global capital, which is then fighting back in an extra economic maneuver, you see. So there, the military industrial complex, the whole Wurlitzer of information warfare becomes useful for actual tangible gains. It's not for, merely the idea of power. Like Apple would be grievously hurt if Huawei and ZTE and so on overturn, and people like in India, you can't afford an Apple phone. People buy Huawei phones until the Indian government, following the US, decided to start banning Chinese products. You see, that's extra economic power. That's a corruption of the marketplace.
I saw Harry Targ's hand. Let me call on Harry next.
Hi, I've been a Vijay Prashad groupie ever since I first used the Darker Nations in my foreign policy class. In the Darker Nations, I think you, Vijay, talk about a more holistic conception of post-World War history, one in which there's the drive towards predominance and, on the other hand, resistance. And you make mention of the new international economic order, the New World Information Order. And my generic question is, could you add to your analysis a discussion of resistance from the global South, aside from China? And I'm thinking of your sense of the whether there's any continuing efficacy for the pink tide, for example, and other such efforts of nations and people in the global South, including international solidarity of non-state actors to resist US imperialism.
Harry, it's great to see you because we have exchanged emails over the years, but we have never actually interacted. So it's terrific to interact with you. I'm going to take advantage of this to share a little about the institute I work for, because it's actually inside your question, if that's okay. So the first thing I would say is that, yes, I'm a great believer in the importance of looking back at the new International Economic Order resolution in the United Nations in 73-74. Please go and read it again. It's a free PDF download from the UN website. It's a terrific document. It's a comprehensive challenge to the way capitalism was shaped. Not necessarily a socialist order itself, but it certainly would have advanced the cause of socialism in the long term. So one need not read it as if to say this is a blueprint for socialism. It's not the critique of the Gotha program, but it's certainly a very important advance made by third world states in the 1970s. And that's part of the reason that third world bloc was a challenge, because it not only criticized the West, but it offered an alternative. And that's key, through the UN Conference of Trade and Development, even through OPEC, the third world articulated an alternative. There's nothing more dangerous. You see, you can have a person outside your house screaming and shouting, You can ignore them. You put earplugs or whatever, you can ignore them. But if they are saying something that is decidedly different and suggesting a different path, they are a threat, because then they might galvanize support from others who'll say, ah, okay, let's listen to this. Okay, so the first thing to recognize is, since the death of the third world, in a sense, in the 1980s, it has not recovered. It has never recovered. What happened in Latin America in the late 1990s, from the election of Hugo Chavez 98, in a sense up to the present, what this phase that has opened in Latin America is a phase of regionalism has opened up. Chavez comes to office in 99. He inaugurates, the critique of the free trade area of the Americas. He makes the case for what becomes ALBA TCP, that is to say, the Bolivarian Alliance of the Americas, the trade pact that was created. Now it's down to 9 countries, but it may increase. We don't know. Pedro Castillo might win the election in Peru. I don't know what direction he'll take the country in. We don't know what's going to happen in Chile later this year. Maybe Daniel Hadwe will win the election. He's a communist. He's right now leading in the polls. We have no idea what might happen. So the Chavez period opens up a phase of electoral path to socialism, which is a different path than what we had seen previously. Legitimizes the electoral path to socialism, but it's a path towards socialism. It's not a path to socialism. It's towards socialism. Because even Venezuela today has a socialist government, but it's not a socialist country. I mean, I'm in Venezuela all the time. Venezuela is a capitalist country. The capitalist class is well alive and well. Their current standard bearer is the pathetic Guaido. They drive around in their fancy cars. I had a meeting with an opposition politician. Do you know what he does for business? He sells swimming pools. That means there's a market for private swimming pools today in Venezuela. It's not a socialist country. We should not exaggerate the situation. It's a socialist government struggling to advance socialism in a capitalist country. You can't expropriate the wealth of the bloc. Then the jet planes will fly and bomb you. As it is, they face enough problems. They don't want to antagonize that class right now. People criticize them, say, why don't they advance the revolution? This is not 1959. We are in a different phase in world history. You've got to, the path of right now, in the weakness of the left suggests the importance of the electoral domain, taking seriously constitutionalism. Every government in Latin America wants to come to power and write a new constitution. Look at Chile. The new constituent assembly is going to be impaneled. The country with the best constitution is Colombia. A constitution written when patriotic Pole, when FARC came out of the jungles in the late 80s. It's a great constitution. Duque, Uribe, they don't give a crap about it, but the constitution itself is not bad. So this is an important part, but Harry, it's regionalism, because it's the Bolivarian area of the Americas, this whole idea of Nuestra America. I mean, it's a very much trapped in a regional consciousness, which is important, and it's a great advance for us. Out of the single countries being taken advantage by imperialism, the character of anti-imperialism in South America and Central America is regional, and that's absolutely important for this moment. What we need to see is, we need to see the regional development take place in Africa, where the African Union has been made, really rendered almost mute. The possibility of regionalism must come in Africa. We've got to see this in Asia, and here I think we won't see it, because China has become so powerful and important that everybody has to have a position vis-a-vis China, rather than develop a regional set of institutions and so on. We're not going to see that. I mean, BRICS was one approach to try a kind of multilateral internationalism, but it's premature. The BRICS was already premature in 2009. It's going to take time. We are in a process now out of unipolarity towards regionalism. Eventually, we'll get to some multipolarity. This is the general. To quote from the Communist Manifesto, this is the line of march. You can't. We are people of the left. We are not idealists. We are not like living in the clouds, idealistic. We are practical people. This is what is possible now. I mean, I want to live in a socialist world, but I'll be dead long before then. I understand how history proceeds. As Marx and Engels write in the German ideology, Communism isn't something that you impose from outside, it's the actual movement of history. So you have to study the actual movement of history, not impose an ideal on the world. Communism is not an ideal. That's a key thing to come to terms with. It's the actual movement of history. So we have to understand the actual movement. That's why I'm often frustrated with ultra left commentary, which takes a idealistic approach. They'll attack China, they'll attack this, attack that from some idealistic perspective. But that's a wrong approach. That's not materialist. That's an idealist Marxism, or that's an idealist leftism. So we have to look at it like that. So in our institute, we were formed out of a meeting held in Brazil in 2015, uh, called Dilemmas of Humanity. It was called by the landless workers movement. And part of the meeting was to create the International Assembly of the People, which is a new kind of movement based platform that is going to develop beyond the World Social Forum, which you didn't have to be a movement to join, you could be an individual. So that didn't work out. So the International Assembly of the People is a platform of 200 people's organizations from around the world, from 100 countries, including Workers' Party of Tunisia, Democratic Way of Morocco, Socialist Party Zambia, Communist Party of Nepal, the MST in Brazil, Patria Grande from Argentina, and Metal Workers Union in South Africa. These are big mass organizations, and we've created the International Assembly of the People. In September, after 5 years, we will launch publicly. But Tricontinental was set up as the research arm of the International Assembly of the People. So we are actually a movement driven research institute. And when I was asked to run Tricontinental, I was told that this is not a research institution in the old sense. I meet with movement leaders constantly. I have to develop research projects alongside the movements. I have to work with the mass base to figure out what the orientations are, what gaps of knowledge there are, and so on. So that's what we are doing, Harry. And the game is to sort of construct. I'll give you an example. In this September, 23 research institutes from around the world, assembled by Tricontinental and ALBA TCP, the Director General Sasha Laurentini and I called a meeting of 23 research institutes, and we are creating a text called Plan for the 7.9 billion, which is shaped after the new international economic order, and we'll release it at the UN in September. So we are also trying to drive an intellectual agenda. We don't have any expectations about it, Harry. It's not like 1973. The correlation of forces is all wrong for the left, but we want to put it out there. Have a look. This is what a healthcare plan should look like. This is what a plan for nature should look like, and so on and so forth.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, Liz Mestris does. And after that, then Betsy Bowman. Yes, Liz, go ahead.
Okay. Hi, Vijay. Good to see you. I don't have a coherent question, but there's just so many things in my head by this. One thing on the sanctions rule, and I just saw a film on Nicaragua that was stressing the illegality of the sanctions, the misinformation, and so forth. But one of the points they were raising was that Nicaragua has become food sovereign because of this. The same thing happened with Cuba with the blockade and the special period on top of it. And so so I've been very interested in these things you're referring to, like mass movements across the globe, like the one that they related to in Nicaragua was Via Campesina, which is, for me, one of the other thing, the other side of the question was around the multiple kinds of crises we're in. And is there a way out for capitalism, itself, let alone us? But people are saying it's socialism or barbarism, or else socialism or extinction at this point in time. it seems to me that what's going on under the surface is very interesting, and the one kind of spot of hope, or one of some. But anyway, I wanted, if you could I hope that was a little bit coherent. Oh, well, the other aspect was when you were talking talking about regionalism. Does that relate to the Chinese multipolar world concept in some way in this context? Okay, I'm sorry this is incoherent.
No, please. By the way, I know Liz from the Brecht Forum in New York, which was a great institution, and I used to prefer the Brecht Forum, Liz, when it was next to Monthly Review.
Oh, yes.
And I have a fond memory in 1994 of being in the Brecht Forum and then walking across and ringing the doorbell and going into Monthly Review, and Paul Sweezy was there. See, it's the first time I met him because I was a trade union organizer in India, and I had written an article about contract labor, and I had mailed it pre-email. I had mailed it to the MR office, and I got a reply from Paul with hand edited text in red ink in his extraordinarily patrician handwriting that he had. He had written a letter, and then I corresponded back and forth, and it was published in 1994 in Monthly Review. I was quite excited. One held Monthly Review and holds Monthly Review. It's a very got a great history. It's a superb journal. Even today, it's work on China under John Bellamy Foster. They're bringing out a special issue later this year. John was telling me about it. It's going to be really special. Anyway, I remember going there, and Sweezy, he didn't have any clue who I was. And I said, I had corresponded with him. He was so warm and nice. 2-3 weeks later, they invited me for lunch there. And they had some sandwiches or whatever. And I was so nervous. And Magdoff was sitting there in that way, he sat like this. I don't think he just sort of slumped into chairs. Meanwhile, Sweezy had a cravat and was so elegant and such a good-looking person. And I remember going in there, and I realized suddenly they wanted me to give a presentation. I had no idea. I thought it was just lunch, but when they meant come to lunch, they sort of had a code word in the Monthly Review world that means come and make a presentation about your article. Oh, I almost died that day. I was so nervous, and all of these people were there. You see, they were all names on a page to me. Especially, Paul Sweezy, I held with the highest, to my mind, the most important American Marxist. Whatever later in life, I realized I have some differences. Under consumptionist thesis. Who cares? What a great man, so brave, holding fast to socialism and Marxism in the darkest days, continuing. That magazine was published without break, right? Right through McCarthy's period. He just kept going. Some people say, he used his position. Whatever he did, he held fast. In the worst time, he continued. What a great guy. I loved that Brecht Forum because every time we took a break from our summer school, I would go into Monthly Review and trawl around the bookshelves. Lovely people. Anyway, so this idea of sanctions having a contradictory benefit is an interesting one. And of course, it's there. Richard Levins, another great American radical, wrote about how Cuba was able to innovate fertilizer. But it's also a little exaggerated, Liz. And I don't know the details of Nicaragua, this particular thing you watched, but it's only a 6 million population, 6-7 million people in Nicaragua. Cuba about 11 million. Venezuela is over 30 million. The scale plays a role in particularly in food sovereignty. But I fear sometimes we exaggerate these things. When we say, they are innovating. Cuba is in really difficult situation even today. I just feel like, I understand the temptation to say, well, they innovated in this way and they innovated in that way. In 2 years ago in Caracas, I do most of my reporting getting drunk in bars. And 2 years ago, I was at a Chavista bar in a part of Caracas, and it was real late at night. And I always often go off by myself, and it's sketchy sometimes at night in Caracas because there's a lot of poverty and so on. And these fellows, they were showing me that they're losing weight. I mean, they've taken their pants in because their physical stature was changing. People are not eating enough. I mean, there's a reality. I saw the same in Nicaragua, Liz. I just feel like, sanctions is a horrible thing. There is no upside. Cuba is really Cuban socialism spluttering on fumes over and over again. Look, right now, they don't have access to syringes to give 22 million jabs for the vaccine. The syringes for Cuba campaign. I don't want to exaggerate anything because paper is in poor. There's very little paper. We can't print books there easily or materials. I mean, sanctions are a cruel
Terrible. Yes.
policy. So I feel sometimes, you know what I mean about that exaggeration temptation. We want desperately to see something good, and there will be. Even Dick Levins, it's true that they were able to grow things without pesticides, without green revolution technologies. That's amazing. But we got to think of the scale and what are we growing, and are people eating enough? It's okay, you're growing. We know you can grow, but are people eating enough? And so on. So I just don't know enough about that particular documentary. I know that Via Campesina does amazing work, and we engage with them a lot, and I very much like them. But they are also between demoralization and exaggeration. Like all of us, all of us, we sort of oscillate between the two. Now, the second part of what you said, I've totally forgotten. Because there was a second part in your question, and I got somehow detached into discussing monthly review. I only remembered the Nicaragua part.
Okay, just briefly, I'll put it another way. Back in the 80s, and when we were next door to Monthly Review, I remember we had a crisis theory series among the left. There was a lot of discussion of what is the kind of crisis we're in. That's kind of, right now I read everything I can on that, and I wish we had that series again. One of the questions is, is there a way out within capitalism at all? For one thing, yeah.
Right. Now I know why I blanked your question. So with two of my comrades, we are working on a little project. We are looking, in fact, it's quite interesting. What's it? Chapter 23 in Capital. I think it's the shortest chapter in Capital, where Marx essentially summarizes the stuff he wrote about in the Introduction to Contribution to Political Economy, 59. When he writes about the productive forces and the social relations of production. In chapter 25 or 23, I think, he goes into it in detail. He talks about the advancement of the productive forces, the socialization of labor, the bringing of science to agriculture, and he makes a list. And then he suggests that as productive forces advance, it'll come to clash with social relations of production rooted in property. So what my colleagues and I are doing as a tricontinental notebook is we're looking at that list and extending the list of advances of productive forces. And we're showing how today productive forces are very advanced. They are super advanced. Like just the fact of, if you just take transportation, apart from defragmentation of things and refragmenting it somewhere else, container ships, it's as good as you get, to carry such tonnage across oceans so fast with 5 workers on a massive container ship, before the pandemic, these things were going back and forth, enormous tonnage of equipment. So just short of, as I said, defragmentation and refragmentation, this is as fast as it gets. Time, space, collapse is taking place and so on. So you can make a list of all these huge advances in productive forces. Look at this Zoom thing. It's incredible. It's unimaginable. You remember in your teenage youth, you wish you had this. You can, when your parents said you're grounded, seriously? Not anymore. Because, now I'm just going to open my computer and talk to my friend. What's grounded? So, in that sense, we can make a list. But what we are suggesting is that while the objective factors, the socialization of labor, for instance, is incredible. We will take a political position against free trade agreements, as we should. But on the other hand, we know that free trade agreements actually advance the productive forces. because you get greater socialization of labor. That was one of the things in that list. You see, you get better usage of labor productivity in free with because there is something to comparative advantage theory. It's not a dumb theory. There is something to it, and so on and so forth. But what we have is we have the objective factors increasing and coming to basically nirvana levels. Look at the amount of goods and services we can produce, but the subjective force is nullified. So the agent of socialism is not available so easily anymore. Trade union density is at its global lowest, and there are reasons for it. And we're going to go into some of this. I mean, it's easy to say people need to organize. The question is how. When you have routine precarious workforces, it's easy to just give a slogan, don't mourn, organize. That's bogus. How will you do it? You know, what's the methodology? What's the procedure? So in India, for instance, the trade union movement has done something fantastic, which is why the strikes have been so strong. There are 93% of the workers in India are in the informal sector. And yet last year in November 26th, 250 million workers went on strike. Because the formal trade union movements have taken up the demands of the informal workers. And they've been organizing them in their homes, where they live, in their neighborhoods. They're not organizing them at the workplace. That's precarious. The working class actually has density, but not in the workplace anymore. They have density where they live. The problem is you can't actually go on strike where you live. So a lot of the struggles you've seen around the world are around water access, like in Cochabamba, electricity. These are about neighborhoods, working class struggles. So why not organize the working class to build strength at home, and then they will take their militancy into their workplaces. And then you can move to the general strike. That's what they did in India. In India, you can't do workplace by workplace strikes because of the precarious situation and so on. So you do a general strike. People just go on strike. Millions of them will just not go to work on one day. It's a political event. Different ways of building the confidence of workers. So all I'm saying is, Liz, it's not a question of like, oh, okay, so what if the objective factor is leading us to crisis? If the subjective factor is not there, the crisis is irrelevant. The crisis is mainly going to hurt us. You can't say, let's take advantage of the crisis. Who is let us? Who is us?
I wasn't suggesting that it was a good thing for us to have that.
No, it's actually an objective problem. It's
Right.
it's not a problem of bad leadership or, you know, I reject those kind of arguments that say, oh, the AFL-CIO has a bad leader, or that this political party has a bad politburo. I reject those arguments because those are too voluntaristic. They assume that if you have a good leader there, you'll be able to drive a better agenda. Yes, that's of course true. Better person in leadership is better than a worse person in leadership. But if the objective conditions are adverse, neither a good leader nor a bad leader can easily drive an agenda. That's the point I want to make.
Okay, if we can
Thank
take a
you.
little bit of extra time. We had
There's
a
a-
question from Betsy Bowman, and after that, I have another question. Betsy, go ahead, unmute yourself. You have to unmute.
Bob also has a question. I just wanted to ask you to say something more about the Tricontinental Institute. Because when I first read that years ago, I was thinking of Samir Amin's organization, a Tricontinental Institute. So if you could just tell us some more about your Tricontinental Institute. And then Bob, what did you want to ask?
Well, I just wanted to ask Vijay, if you think it's possible that the military-industrial complex has itself become the means and the end of imperialism, that imperialist foreign policy generating enemies is an excuse for using the overwhelming tax power to keep that segment of the economy alive and well in which the ruling class invests, and from which it gains directly. So that it's really imperialist foreign policy is an instrument of internal capitalist arrangements, which are no longer capitalist. It's using the taxing power to keep the arms industry going.
On the Transnational Institute, here's the webpage for that. I encourage people to check out their website. There's lots of valuable information there. It's tricontinental.org. Go ahead, Vijay.
Okay, I actually have to leave in about 10 minutes if that's okay. I'm sorry. But very quickly, firstly, well, yes, the word tricontinental is common. It often goes back to the conference held in Cuba in 1966, which was the Tricontinental Conference called by the Cuban government to become a national liberation, phalanx of the non-aligned movement. They had still close relations with NAM, which was created in 61. Out of the Tricontinental Conference comes OSPAL, which is the Organization in Solidarity with the People of Asia, Africa, Latin America, which had a magazine called Tricontinental. And then it wasn't Samir so much, it was an organization in Belgium that also took the name Tricontinental. And we developed the name out of the Havana Conference when we started in 2017. And actually then the Cuban government closed down OSPAL around that time. And so we are, essentially a movement organization. We don't have any links to the Belgian organization. I actually didn't know they existed till a few years ago, but they do some very interesting work there. Samir's group was in Dakar in Senegal, and it was called the Third World Network. And I knew Samir very well. And in fact, one of our early tricontinental publications is the last interview Samir gave before he died. It's a beautiful interview. He was a terrific man. And I don't know, I think many of you would have met him. He's a terrific guy. And I really liked his approach to the world a lot. When I think back at Accumulation on a World Scale, I would say that's a book that influenced me a great deal, influenced me personally. So the issue of whether the military-industrial complex is a self-generating, is a self-generating structure, it's a credible argument. And in fact, going back to Sweezy and what's his name?
Magdoff.
Magdoff?
Not Magdoff. Monopoly Capital. Baran. Sweezy and Baran. Paul Baran and Sweezy, Paul Sweezy. They wrote a book called Monopoly Capital, which is a remarkable book. And in there is a suggestion of this argument that the military-industrial complex essentially becomes self-generating. I don't actually think that explains everything, because there are actually some tangible benefits to certain sectors of global capital by having the US play the role of the gendarme. There are actually tangible benefits. It's not just for its own regeneration that it exercises power. I think you can see tangible benefits outside its own circuit of power. For instance, to overthrow the government of Bolivia was part of the Cold War against China. That's a benefit beyond the military-industrial complex. So I feel that there's some interesting truth to what that argument suggests, and there's again a venerable line of argument like this. But I actually don't think it explains everything, because if it is true, then the United States wouldn't be scrupulous in its exercise of power. It could exercise it against anybody, But there is a logic to who it goes after, and I think that's, to me, an interesting feature.
Okay. Can you hang with us for a few more minutes, Vijay?
Well, I'll certainly answer your question, because that's out of politeness, because you are my principal host. So why don't you ask me the question? I'll answer your question, and then I'll have to take off, unfortunately.
All right. Well, I'll be brief, although the answer is not brief. It's very complex. you've been talking about imperialism in terms of state power, the exercise of state power. And one of the new approaches to the understanding of imperialism that has come about in this era of globalization is the exercise of corporate power directly independent of state action by transnational corporations. I'm thinking, for example, of the work of William I. Robinson, who tries to avoid a state-centric analysis. And for example, when you talk about the preponderance of power as the objective of the US, well, that's basically state power that's involved, but there's also the preponderance of capitalist power, which to a significant extent has been detached from the exercise of state actors, although it's often buttressed, backed up by them. What do you think of Robinson's thesis in that regard?
Well, I reviewed some of his work once in a journal exchange where I considered him to have a Kautskyite view of the world. Super imperialism, like there's going to be the creation of one capitalist class. I don't accept that view because the world is still organized by nation states. And I think there are still complicated mediations between capitalist classes of different countries. So I think it's just because you see people go to Davos together doesn't mean that they are making some sort of conspiratorial policy together. I mean, Lenin's takedown of Kautsky's super imperialist thesis applies equally to Robinson, and I mean I very much stand with the Lenin position even 100 years later, because I think that not much has changed in terms of mediations. You see, isn't that the key thing in any theory? It's not the abstraction that's important, it's the mediations back to concrete events. Isn't that what Marx spent decades trying to work out? What are the mediations? You can have that. Well, look, we all know capitalism is about accumulating profits. Okay, we got that. Thanks. Bye. You need the mediations after that. How do you understand to go from the factory floor to the bank account? How does that work? It's all about mediation. So I find William Robinson's work to be very interesting, but it's just at a high level of abstraction. Doesn't get it, I don't really, there's not enough grip for me. I also don't agree that capital is detached from state power. I don't think so, because corporations always operate in a mercantilist fashion. They will always operate through the power of this state or that state. They don't operate independently. They can't, because there are national laws and there is international law. So a corporation in India, for instance, has to collude with the government at every turn. It cannot exercise power by itself. It will have to take advantage of state bureaucracies, the police. It can't just evict people. Actually, in fact, before modern capitalism, corporations were much more independent. The East India Company, for instance, in India operated as a state. It was much more independent. I was in Papua New Guinea visiting a mining company, Australian mining company. The mining company, they behave like gangsters, but they have to keep calling in the PNG police. They have to keep being bribe people. The state has to always be involved. And so in that sense, I don't think you can get away from the state as an institution of imperialism. Exxon Mobil doesn't bomb countries. It doesn't. I mean, where are the Pinkertons of the 21st century? Even the private mercenary forces that operate on behalf of governments. They don't operate on behalf of companies, except in very small localities, where you have armed forces killing off people and so on. But by and large, they operate alongside governments or challengers to governments. For instance, mercenaries in Libya who are fighting with Khalifa Haftar. Khalifa Haftar has a pretension of being the head of government. So he's got mercenary forces with him. You don't see, Blackwater in Iraq. They were fighting with the US military. They were not fighting with ExxonMobil. So I don't actually see today how corporate power can act independently of states. Even when corporate power acts in its economic way, strictly economic way, where they can pull their investments from a country and threaten a country and so on. Frequently, it's the US ambassador that goes and does the threatening on behalf of a corporation. And you see this in the WikiLeaks dump. You'll see in Bolivia, the US ambassador is the one who went to Morales and said to him, you can do this, that, and the other. US ambassador, I've talked to Morales, I've talked about this with them. A US ambassador would come in and speak on behalf of US mining companies. The mining company didn't even do it on their own. So I just, when you look at the mediations, corporate power is enormously powerful. But why should they act independently and sully their reputations when they can get some gangster bureaucrat to dip their hands in blood and do the work for them? And they do willingly. That's the other thing.
Okay, well, thank you for that note, Vijay. I asked it because in a few weeks we will have Robinson in one of our webinars. But thank you very much for your presentation today. I'm sure we all enjoyed it. I see lots of thumbs ups around the screen. And I understand you're headed off to Venezuela in a few days. And I wish you well. And maybe we can get a report back from you on the situation there, because there is so much misinformation available in the US media.
Anytime. Okay. Bye.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you again.
Bye.
Thank you.
Today's webinar,
Thank you.
as well
Bye-bye.
as our past programs, are available on YouTube, accessible from our website, www.globaljusticecenter.org. I want to invite you to join us next week, when we will talk about US-Mexico solidarity. There'll be a report from the Mexico Solidarity Project with Javier Bravo and Bill Gallegos. That's next Monday, June 7th. So please tune in for that. And in closing, I want to thank our webinar team, Liz Mestres, Gregory Diamond, Roberto Robles, Olivia Canales, Bob Stone, and yours truly. And now, this is Cliff Durand signing off until next Monday.